So this summer, we've been journeying with the church calendar of readings, and we've been going through the narrative of Genesis, following the mothers and fathers of the faith, listening to their stories, learning from their examples, and recognizing that God shows up in interesting ways to interesting people at unexpected times. And I think that holds true here for us in chapter 28. What we find is a man named Jacob who's on the run. He's on the run from his family, from his community, and from mistakes from his past that are finally catching up with him. Now, if you remember last Sunday in Genesis 25, we heard the story of both Jacob and his brother Esau's birth. And Jacob is named the grasper, the one who grabs, because he comes out of the womb holding on to his brother's heel. Jacob is a bit of a heel if you know his story, but it's interesting here that at this point in Genesis 28, the one who is called the grasper has nothing to hold on to. He's leaving his home. He's going to a place that he's not familiar with, but he's got some distant family members who are ready to receive him. But right now, he's in an in-between space, vulnerable, exposed, afraid. If you're familiar with the story of Jacob, you probably don't have any sympathy for this situation that he's put himself in. Jacob is calculating and cruel. He's devious and nefarious. He's not very kind to those who love him and who make space for him. At any point in his story, both his father, his brother, and his father-in-law will all accuse him of being treacherous. Not really the people you want to betray, the ones who will love you unconditionally. And yet, that's who Jacob is. Not worthy of our sympathy. And yet, we have this story in our annals, this story we come back to time and time again, where we lift up Jacob as a father of the faith, as a hero, as someone to admire and learn from. I think that's pretty interesting. Not somebody we'd pick out of a lineup if we wanted to have mentors and heroes and examples, right? But this is the one we're given by the gift of the tradition. Jacob, the grasper, is our hero for today. Earlier this week, I came across a quote from a guy who lived about 100 years ago. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor and a theologian in Germany during the rise of the Nazis and during World War II. And Bonhoeffer was prolific in his letter writing. He loved to write letters. And in 1936, he wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, who was an admirer of the German liberal Protestant movement. German liberal Protestantism, if you're not familiar, eventually supported and joined forces with the Nazi Party in Germany. And so Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law is an admirer of this theological movement, and Bonhoeffer is writing him a letter where he's trying to convince him of another perspective. But there's this quote in here that I found fascinating as I read Jacob's story, and I want to put it on the screen. This is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer says to his brother-in-law. Either I determine the place where I want to find God, or I let him, that is God, determine the place where he wants to be found. If it is I who says where God is to be found, then I will always find a God there who in some manner corresponds to me, is pleasing to me, and who is commensurate with my own nature. But if it is God who says where he is to be found, then it will probably be a place that is not at all commensurate with my own nature, and that does not please me at all. Now, I know that's a little bit of a strong statement, and perhaps we weren't meant to read these letters 70 years later because this is a family squabble, but I think the point stands, especially when we relate it to what's happening here in Jacob's life. That we look for God in the places where we want to find God. We look for God in the places where we want to encounter God. And what we see here in Jacob's story is that God doesn't show up when Jacob's on top. He doesn't show up when he's in control and in charge. God has not made this divine appearance, so far as we know, in Jacob's life until this very moment. When Jacob's in the wilderness, when he's alone, when he's got nothing to his name, no possessions but a rock to lay his head upon. He is vulnerable and not very impressive. And it's here that God appears. Not a place that would be commensurate with Jacob's own nature, not a place that would be pleasing to Jacob at all. But I think there's something else to this quote that matters for us this morning. Those who are hearers of this story thousands of years later, as we think about who Jacob is, what kind of character he is. And then we see God show up in this dream at Bethel in this barren place and make all these unilateral promises to Jacob. Jacob, a man who has not shown any interest or awareness in divine realities. Jacob, who is only out for his own good, even at the expense of family. Jacob, who doesn't seem to care much at all for church or tradition or worship. It's to Jacob that God appears and says things like, I will give you this land and to your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until what I have done, what I have promised you. Pretty bold statements for the God of the universe to make to a man like Jacob. Wouldn't God say those words to somebody who was more deserving, had more merit, was worthy of such statements? But no, God shows up to a man like Jacob and makes these covenant vows. If you're paying attention to the story of Jacob, and you get to this point in the story, you should be a little disappointed with God, or maybe even disgusted. That God would show up in such a favoritist way with such an unworthy character. And so perhaps Bonhoeffer's words ring true for us even in 2026, that God shows up in places and to people that we would not expect and that would not be pleasing to us. Nevertheless, that is where God appears. Something that's interesting here in this passage that you won't get in the English, if you went back to read the Hebrew in which Genesis is originally written, is that there's this word that says vehine is the Hebrew. It's a phrase, vehine, which we would translate as behold, look, surprise. That word in Hebrew appears 4 times in 4 verses here in chapter 28. When Jacob lies down with the rock as a pillow, all of a sudden vehine appears in the narrative. It's meant to convey a sense of shock and unexpectedness, that God appears and we weren't looking for it. It's supposed to take us by surprise. And I wonder if that's not true for our own lives as well. That it's often the times when we least expect God to show up, or perhaps the times when we least desire God to appear, catching us in a state that's not very presentable. Vehine. Surprise. Behold. That's where God shows up. This is the God we have. The one who's not very impressed with our presentation, with the facades we often put on, with the ways we try to make ourselves valuable or worth it. God's interested in us for who we really are. Kind of a surprise, kind of a shock. That even in our most vulnerable and exposed, and in the times we think we are least wanted and worthy, that's where we might encounter this unshakable presence of love. I was reminded this week of an encounter I had a few years ago at a previous church, when a woman walked into the church's main office and asked to speak with a pastor. Now, about 85 to 90% of the time when somebody comes in and makes that request, I prepare a statement about how the church doesn't trust me to handle the money, the finances, and I need to direct you to this person instead who actually has control over the amount we can help you with and what you're looking for. And so I was already kind of jaded and cynical at that point. So I was rehearsing the right person to send them to and to be sure to say that, the church cares about you, but we've got these rules in place, and I'm sorry if we can't help you as much as you want. I was going over that, and I encountered the woman in the main office, and she said, "I need to speak with you." It was a woman I had never encountered before, but she seemed very serious, so I led her into a quiet parlor area right across the hallway from the church, and she began to tell me a story about how she had left her community on the border after having severed and broken every relationship she had in that place. That because of things she had done, people no longer trusted her, no longer welcomed her, and so she felt like she had to leave. She made her way from the border up to San Antonio, and she was unsure about what was to come next in her life. She wanted to go home because that's where she had connections, that's where she could get a job, but she didn't have a place to live. She was living out of her car in San Antonio. But she didn't ask me for money. She didn't ask me for relief. She didn't even ask me for non-perishable food items. She just told her story. And as I listened to her and the pain of her own past actions, the consequences that she was now experiencing, the loneliness, the isolation, the anxiety and fear about what was to come, the only thing I could do in that moment was to tell her that God forgives her. I remember specifically having this moment when I realized that God wanted me to tell her that God wasn't holding that against her. Those things she had done, those things she had failed to do with her previous community, with those she had left in the past who no longer wanted anything to do with her, that God wasn't counting it. That God wasn't interested in keeping score. That God loved her. And I remember when I said those words, the tears welled up in her eyes and she began to weep. Not out of sorrow, out of relief. That she had been waiting for words like that to fall upon her in a barren wilderness place in her life. She went on. I never encountered her again, but what I do remember following that interaction is a sense of guilt that racked me. I replayed the scenario time and time again in my mind, and I wondered, was I doing the right thing? Did I make the responsible choice? Not having known this woman at all, could she have been telling me a story? Leading me on a wild goose chase? Could she have been dishonest? Was she really a terrible person who wasn't deserving, who needed to be held accountable? Did I do the responsible thing as a pastor by offering such words of unmerited grace? The guilt ate at me for quite some time until I forgot about it and moved on to the next person, the next thing. And then when I read this story this week about Jacob finding himself in a quiet, lonely place and the unilateral, extravagant promises of God made in such a desperate situation to such an unworthy person, I remembered that woman. And I realized that God was trying to teach me something. That it's in the places where we're least impressive, that we're most open, that's where God shows up. Where might you find God? Perhaps God wants to be found at the end of your rope. 1,500 years ago, a man named Isaac of Nineveh, who was a famous poet and hymn writer in the early church, preached a sermon extravagantly titled Homily 51. That was a joke. That's about how I name my sermons too, Homily 51. But these words are very moving when you listen to them carefully. 1,500 years ago, this is what somebody who was living in modern day Iraq said about God. As a handful of sand thrown into the great sea, so are the sins of all flesh in comparison with the mind of God. And just as a strongly flowing spring is not obstructed by a handful of dust, So the mercy of the Creator is not stemmed by the vices of his creatures. And we Methodists thought we invented this idea called grace. Behold! Surprise! In the places and times among the people you wouldn't expect, there God can be found.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.